It was many years after the strange affair of the Portland Place mirrors that Dr. John Watson, now settled into a more placid existence, found his thoughts returning again and again to that singular night when every reflective surface in a great London house turned suddenly, impossibly, to darkness. Had he not been present at the subsequent investigation? Had he not watched, with his own eyes, Sherlock Holmes disentangle that baffling knot, Watson might well have placed the tale among the superstitious romances of penny dreadfuls and tavern talk. Yet the case had occurred in the sober light of late Victorian London, under the gaze of Scotland Yard, and amid all the solid respectability of Portland Place. It began, as so many of their strangest adventures did, with a death that refused to behave like an ordinary death. Shortly after midnight on the 14th of November 1895, the household of Sir Jasper Mayton was roused by a scream. Portland Place lay under a wet, clinging fog that night, the lamps along the broad thoroughfare glowing as though seen through dirty glass. Within number 48, however, gaslight burned cheerfully in several windows. A dinner of some importance had been held there, and though most of the guests had long since departed, the household had not yet fully settled into silence. It was a footman who heard the cry. He was crossing the first-floor landing with a coal scuttle in his hands when the sound knifed through the corridor. A high, strangled exclamation, more of a choked gasp than a fully formed scream. The coal scuttle slipped from his grasp and clattered against the skirting board, but he scarcely noticed it. The sound had come from Sir Jasper's dressing-room. "Sir Jasper?" the young man called, his voice sounding thin in the sudden hush that followed. "Sir Jasper, sir—" There was no reply. He stood for a moment, uncertain, his eyes fixed upon the half-open door at the end of the corridor. The gas flames flickered faintly in their wall brackets, and every shadow seemed enlarged and watchful. Gathering his courage, the footman moved forward and knocked. "Sir Jasper?" Silence. He pushed the door a little wider and peered in. The dressing-room beyond was lit but oddly dim, as though the light was somehow swallowed before it could fully fill the space. It took his unsteady senses a moment to understand why. Every mirror in the room was black. It was not that they reflected only shadow. Rather, each looking-glass, above the washstand, upon the cheval frame, inside the wardrobe door, had become an opaque, dull surface, like soot-smeared glass. Where the young man expected to see his own pale, anxious face, he saw only a flat, lightless darkness. The gas jet hissed feebly above the washstand. Its flame burned steady enough, but its light seemed to recoil from those darkened panels, leaving the corners of the room sunk in a dusky gloom. "Sir," he began again. Then he saw the body. Sir Jasper Mayton lay upon the rug before the tall cheval glass, one arm flung out, the other drawn up toward his chest. His nightshirt gaped at the throat, showing the stringy pallor of the neck. The footman needed only a glance to know that something was terribly wrong in that stillness. The way the head lolled, the unnatural twist in the torso, the eyes half open and clouded, in a manner that suggested not sleep, but the cessation of all that animated a man. The coal-stained hands shook so violently that he had trouble finding his voice, but when it came in a panicked shout that rang through all 3 floors of the house. Within minutes, the corridor outside Sir Jasper's rooms was a crush of startled faces and hastily donned garments. Lady Mayton, pale even in her better hours, and now nearly translucent with shock, clutched a dressing-gown about her as she tried to push past the servants. A younger woman, Miss Clara Mayton, the baronet's niece, supported her, while the butler, Mr. Greaves, stood like a dark, rigid boundary between the family and the scene within. "You must not go in, my lady," Greaves was saying, his voice steady in defiance of the tumult. "I beg you for your health. Allow me to send for the doctor first, and the police." "The police?" Lady Mayton echoed, as though the word had been spoken in some foreign tongue. "Jasper may have had an attack. He has not been well." "No, my lady," Greaves replied gravely. "It is not—" He glanced back into the dressing-room, and for one unguarded instant, something like horror crossed his lined features. "It is not an ordinary seizure. Sir Jasper is quite beyond the help of a physician." It was then that Miss Mayton drew her aunt gently away and took command. "Greaves, send for the doctor at once, regardless," she said, her voice low but firm. "And for the police, if you truly believe it necessary. Have the servants stand back. No one is to touch anything in that room until the authorities arrive. Do you understand?" Greaves bowed his head. "Yes, Miss Clara." She took a deep breath and pressed her lips together, as if fearful that any looseness there might allow a scream to escape. Her dark hair had come partly unpinned and framed her face in disordered waves, but there was resolution in her eyes. "What has happened?" Lady Mayton whispered beside her. "Why will no one tell me what has happened?" Clara hesitated, then turned her aunt's head gently away from the open doorway. "Aunt Edith," she said softly, "I must ask you to trust us for a little while longer. Greaves is right. It is better that you do not go in. Come, sit down. We shall have some brandy brought up." "The mirrors," muttered the footman, who had not yet entirely recovered his composure. "You should have seen the mirrors. All black they were, every one of them, as though the house had gone blind." "Be quiet, Thomas," Greaves snapped, losing for the first time a little of his composure, but the words had already done their work. A murmur rose among the servants, an anxious tangle of conjecture and superstition. "All the mirrors?" whispered one of the housemaids. "That's a bad sign, that is. My grandmother always said—" "What your grandmother said has no bearing in this house," Greaves retorted sharply. "Hold your tongues, the lot of you. You will bring bad luck enough with your gossip." He turned away, his heavy tread receding down the staircase as he went to rouse the coachman and send for Dr. Stapleton. Inside the dressing-room, the gas flame continued to hiss softly, illuminating the odd scene with a weak, imperfect light. Sir Jasper lay motionless at the foot of the cheval glass, whose once silvered surface had become a flat, obsidian smear. By the washstand, the small shaving glass was similarly obscured, and within the wardrobe, the full-length mirror on the inside of the door showed nothing of the neat rows of shirts and jackets opposite, only a dark, unyielding opacity. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of a small French clock upon the mantel. It read 7 minutes past 12. By the time Inspector Tobias Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived at Portland Place, the fog outside had thickened into a grey wool that muffled the rattle of cabs and swallowed the lamplight. The hansom that carried him from the yard rolled almost ghost-like along the empty street, its wheels whispering on the damp cobbles. Lestrade stepped down, buttoning his coat more tightly about his narrow frame, and took in the sombre facade of number 48 with practised eyes. A house in which something had gone very wrong had, in his experience, a look about it, a tension in the windows, a suggestion that the very brickwork was listening. Number 48 seemed, if anything, too composed. Only the faint glow behind the drawn curtains and the shadow of a figure passing now and then betrayed the wakeful distress within. He was admitted at once by the butler, whose normally impassive features bore traces of strain. "Inspector Lestrade?" Greaves inquired. "That's me," Lestrade said shortly. "You sent for the police, Sir Jasper Mayton?" "Yes, sir. If you would follow me." Lestrade stepped into a wide, well-appointed hallway, his glance taking automatic note of details, the quality of the carpets, the number and livery of the servants, the portraits upon the walls, respectable, wealthy, old family. Not the sort of house usually touched by the coarser forms of crime, but then death and scandal cared little for social pedigrees. "Who found the body?" he asked as they mounted the stairs. "Thomas, the footman," Greaves replied. "He heard a cry and went to Sir Jasper's dressing room. He discovered—" The butler paused. "He discovered him there? In what position?" "Lying before the cheval glass, sir. On his back, one arm extended. I took the liberty of drawing the blinds, but I have not allowed anything to be moved." "You did quite right," Lestrade said. They reached the first-floor landing, where the family had retreated to a nearby sitting room. Lestrade caught a glimpse of a pale, delicate-faced woman on a sofa, Lady Myton, presumably, and a younger lady at her side whose dark eyes watched his passage with a mixture of anxiety and calculation. He made a mental note of her and passed on. The dressing-room door stood half open. Even before Lestrade stepped across the threshold, he felt the curious wrongness of the space. The gaslight burning above the washstand did its best, but the room seemed oddly lightless, as though the air itself begrudged the flame. He entered, and his brow furrowed. "Well now," he murmured, "that's a pretty piece of work." Sir Jasper Myton lay precisely as Greaves had described him, his tall, spare figure extended upon the rug. His face, thin and hawkish in life, was now drawn back from his teeth in a grimace that might have been pain or surprise. The hands were lax, the eyes half open. There was no visible blood, no sign of struggle beyond the unnatural angle at which his head rested. Lestrade's gaze moved from the body to the cheval glass, and there it stayed. The tall mirror that stood opposite Sir Jasper's outstretched hand did not show, as it should have done, the reflection of the ceiling, the lamp, the body, or the inspector himself. Instead, it presented to him an unbroken expanse of dull darkness, like a panel of black stone. He narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. He could see, now that he was within arm's reach, the ghost of his own outline upon the surface, a faint, colourless suggestion of movement, but it was as though he were looking through a thick veil of smoked glass. No detail, no clarity. "What the devil?" he muttered. "Just so, sir," Greaves said quietly from the doorway. "All of the mirrors have taken on this appearance." Lestrade ran his fingers lightly over the frame, then tapped the glass itself with a knuckle. It gave back a perfectly normal sound. He glanced at the small shaving glass on the washstand and the wardrobe door, and found the same phenomenon there. "Any lamps or candles near them? Any fire?" he asked. "No, sir. Only the gas jet you see there. The fire in the bedroom was nearly out when we came up." Lestrade crouched by the body. Sir Jasper's skin was cool to the touch. There was a faint bluish tinge about the lips. He pressed gently at the jaw, examined the whites of the eyes, and then leaned closer to the neck. When he straightened, his expression was thoughtful. "And the time?" he asked. "When was he last seen alive?" "After the guests departed," Greaves replied. "Close upon 11 o'clock, I should say. Sir Jasper retired to his rooms then. Lady Myton went upstairs shortly before. Miss Clara remained below with me a while to see that everything was in order."
"After the dinner? And the cry?" "Just after midnight. The French clock there," he nodded toward the mantel, "stopped at 7 minutes past 12. We believe it was about that time. Thomas says he was on his way to bank the fires for the night." Lestrade glanced at the clock. Its delicate hands, indeed, pointed to 7 minutes past 12. The inspector reached out and lifted it gently, turning it to examine the back. The key still protruded from the winding hole. "Was it in working order?" he asked. Yes, sir. Sir Jasper was most particular about his clocks. Lestrade set it down again and straightened, letting his gaze sweep the room. The faint odour of gas, no more than one might expect from a burning jet, hung about, mingled with the sense of starch, cologne, and cold ashes from the bedroom grate beyond the half-open communicating door. The air did not have the heavy, treacherous thickness of a gas-filled room. He had smelled that suffocating sweetness often enough in his time. No, this was something else. He noticed, almost by accident, a small irregularity on the carpet near Sir Jasper's right foot, a smudge, perhaps, darker than the surrounding pile. He bent and touched it, then drew back his fingertips, frowning. A faint black stain marked the skin. Soot? Powder? It was hard to say in that dim, reluctant light. "Has anything been taken?" he asked. "Any drawers rifled? Any valuables missing?" "Not that we have yet discovered, sir," Greaves answered. "Sir Jasper's watch is on the dressing table, and I believe his cufflinks are in that box. Perhaps Miss Clara could confirm." "Presently," Lestrade said. "For now, I want everyone to remain where they are. No one leaves the house." He took one more look at the darkened mirrors, their blank surfaces swallowing the feeble glow of the gas jet. "If this is some trick," he muttered under his breath, "it's a clever one. And if it's not a trick—" He left the sentence unfinished. Lestrade was not a man easily given to fancy. He believed in the solid, observable facts of crime, the blunt instruments, the stolen goods, the jealousies and debts that drove men to desperate acts. Yet as he stood in that oddly dim dressing room with the dead baronet at his feet and those uncanny, lightless mirrors all around, he felt a prickle at the back of his neck. He had dealt with stranglers in Whitechapel, frauds in Mayfair, and blackmailers who preyed upon the highest in the land. He had never, in all his years at the Yard, encountered a scene quite like this. "This will want careful handling," he said aloud, if only to ground himself in the sound of his own voice. He drew himself up. "Very careful indeed." And then, quite suddenly, another thought presented itself to him, born of a past in which his professional pride had more than once been bruised by a singular consulting detective in Baker Street. Lestrade looked again at the dead man, the stopped clock, and the blackened mirrors. "Greaves," he said, turning toward the butler, "have one of your men fetch a cab at once. I shall need to go to Baker Street." "To Baker Street, sir?" Greaves repeated. "Yes, to 221B. Lestrade's mouth tightened in a thin line. "We shall see what Mr. Sherlock Holmes makes of a house where every mirror has turned its face to the dark." Lestrade arrived on Baker Street a little before 1 o'clock, the fog having thickened to a clinging shroud that blurred the lamplight and deadened every sound save the rhythmic clop of the hansom's horse. The familiar brass 221B glimmered faintly as he ascended the steps, and before he lifted his hand to the knocker, the door swung open as though anticipating him. Mrs. Hudson, wrapped in a shawl, blinked in consternation at the unexpected visitor. "Inspector Lestrade, at this hour?" "My apologies, Mrs. Hudson," he said, brushing damp fog from his coat, "but I must see Mr. Holmes at once. It is a matter of some urgency." Before she could reply, a familiar voice carried down the stairs. "Lestrade, is that you? Then come up, man, and be quick about it." Holmes's tone was one of brisk expectation, as though the inspector's arrival at such an hour were the most natural thing in the world. Lestrade felt the usual mixture of irritation and relief as he climbed the narrow staircase. Holmes stood by the fireplace, long dressing gown belted loosely at the waist, violin in one hand, bow in the other. His sharp, hawk-like features were illuminated by the glow from the hearth, and his grey eyes were bright with curiosity. "You come at an interesting moment," Holmes remarked. Watson and I were just debating whether the fog tonight is dense enough to qualify as a true London pea super or merely an enthusiastic imitation, but I suspect your errand is of a more substantial nature. His gaze narrowed. You look disturbed. Lestrade did not sit until Holmes gestured to a chair. He laid his hat on the table and took a steadying breath. I have just come from Portland Place, he began. There's been a death. Sir Jasper Myton. Watson, who had been half dozing in his armchair with a medical journal on his lap, looked up sharply. Sir Jasper, the philanthropist. The same, said Lestrade, found dead in his dressing room shortly after midnight. Holmes set his violin aside. And what, pray, brings you to Baker Street rather than proceeding with your usual inquiries? It isn't the death itself that's the odd part, although that is strange enough. It's the state of the room. The mirrors, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's expression shifted infinitesimally. He leaned forward. Mirrors? Every last one of them was black, Lestrade said. Not broken, not painted, just black. As though something had swallowed the reflection, the cheval glass, the shaving glass, even the wardrobe door mirror, all of them. A silence followed. Holmes tapped his fingertips together, and Watson saw that peculiar spark he had come to recognize, the glint that signaled a mind stirring to delight in an impossible puzzle. Blackened mirrors, Holmes repeated softly. A dead man, a stopped clock. He fixed Lestrade with a piercing gaze. The clock, it's time? 7 minutes past 12, Lestrade answered, right about when the cry was heard. Was there any smell? Any residue? Anything to suggest the mirrors were tampered with chemically? I examined them as closely as I dared. No solvent marks, the glass sounded normal under the knuckle. But their surfaces looked clouded, as though coated in smoke but without any smearing, and the room felt oddly dim, even with the gas turned up. Holmes rose swiftly and began pacing. And the body? Any sign of violence? Lestrade hesitated. No wounds, but the face was strange, almost contorted, and there was a slight bluish tinge to the lips. Could be heart failure, could be poison. Hard to say at a glance. Holmes made a thoughtful sound. Watson, your medical opinion, without yet seeing the body. Watson closed his journal and stood. A bluish tinge might suggest asphyxiation or certain toxins, a contorted expression, perhaps sudden pain, but without examination I would not hazard more. Holmes nodded. Indeed, and the household? All present and accounted for, Lestrade said. The butler Greaves, Lady Myton, and Miss Clara Myton, Sir Jasper's niece. A footman discovered the body after hearing a cry. No one claims to have entered the room after that, save Greaves to draw the blinds and ensure the family kept away. A commendably disciplined household, Holmes murmured, but too disciplined, perhaps. He stopped pacing abruptly. Watson, your coat. Lestrade, you shall return to Portland Place with us. Lestrade blinked. Now? At this hour? Most deaths occur at inconvenient hours, Holmes said dryly. This one, I fear, is no exception. The conditions will not be improved by waiting. Watson was already pulling on his boots. Holmes, do you suspect foul play? Holmes reached for his hat and cane. I never suspect, my dear Watson. I consider, and at present I consider that a man of Sir Jasper Myton's constitution does not simply collapse in a room where every reflective surface abruptly ceases to reflect. Lestrade followed the two men down the stairs. There is something else, he said. Something small, perhaps, but you always seem to care for trivialities. Trivialities, Holmes said with satisfaction, are the very hinges upon which mysteries pivot. Continue. There was a smudge on the carpet, Lestrade went on, near the body. Black. Similar shade to the mirrors, though not identical. I touched it. It left a faint mark on my fingers. Holmes paused mid-step on the landing.
You touched it, Lestrade bristled. I am not entirely new to my trade, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's lips twisted. No, indeed, and yet I will forgive you. You touched it in the name of curiosity, and curiosity is a virtue I admire. Watson, remind me to check the inspector's fingers upon arrival. Watson chuckled. I shall make a note. Outside, the fog hung so thick that the street lamps appeared as dim halos, and the cab they hailed seemed to materialize from the mist like an obedient phantom. As they mounted, Holmes leaned forward, eyes keen. Lestrade, describe again the disposition of the mirrors. Were any of them positioned such that Sir Jasper could have seen himself in more than one at once? Lestrade considered. The cheval glass directly faced him, the washstand mirror to his left, the wardrobe mirror at an angle behind. Why? Holmes sat back. Because a man confronted with multiple reflections is, in effect, confronted with multiple viewpoints, and if all those viewpoints turn dark simultaneously... His voice trailed off. Watson regarded him. You consider the blackening connected to the moment of death. I consider it a phenomenon requiring explanation, Holmes replied. And in my experience, phenomena rarely confine themselves to coincidence. They rode in silence for several minutes. The city around them lay hushed, as though London itself held its breath. At last Lestrade said in a low voice, Holmes, do you imagine some contrivance, some device, something that could alter mirrors in that fashion? Holmes's answer was immediate. Every effect has a cause, Inspector. Even the most inexplicable events occur according to natural laws. If a contrivance exists, I shall find it. If an illusion has been wrought, I shall unmask it. And if a murderer stands behind this shadowy business, rest assured, we shall bring him into the light. The cab rattled onward through the fog toward Portland Place, the three men leaning forward in shared anticipation, the suspense thickening with every turning wheel. And as they approached the silent facade of number 48, Watson could not help a quiet shiver. For reasons he could not yet name, he felt that whatever awaited them within that house was unlike any case he and Holmes had encountered before. And it had only just begun. The cab pulled up before number 48, Portland Place, with a soft crunch of wheels on damp gravel. The fog had grown thicker still, coiling around the wrought-iron railings and lending the house an air of muted menace, as though the night itself wished to keep its secrets hidden within those walls. Holmes stepped down first, his movements brisk, and glanced sharply at the upstairs windows where a thin ribbon of lamplight leaked through the curtains of the dressing-room. "Note, Watson," he murmured, "how the atmosphere of a house shifts after a sudden death. Even from the street one senses a change, an apprehension, that neither servants nor gaslight can disguise." Watson felt it as well, an uncanny stillness, the kind that precedes the unveiling of some deeper truth. Greaves opened the door almost immediately, as though he had been standing sentry behind it. His expression stiffened at the sight of Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade, please come in." Holmes removed his hat with a slight bow. "You have preserved the room exactly as it was?" "Yes, sir. No one has entered since the inspector left." "Excellent. Dr. Stapleton has not yet arrived?" "Not yet, sir." Holmes nodded and strode inside, shedding his overcoat with the swift, unceremonious air of a man who anticipated discovery. Watson followed, with Lestrade close behind. The family had retreated to the same sitting-room as before. Lady Myton lay reclined on a sofa, a glass of brandy trembling faintly in her hand. Clara Myton stood beside her, calm though taut with alertness. Her dark eyes flicked toward Holmes, studying him with a mixture of hope and wary curiosity. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked quietly. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service, Miss Meaton." "I trust Inspector Lestrade has told you—" "He has told me enough," Holmes interjected gently. "The rest, Miss Myton, I shall ascertain for myself." Before she could reply, Lady Myton let out a faint murmur, her eyes fluttering shut. "She's been in a state of shock," Clara said softly. "I fear she will not rest easily until the truth of this dreadful matter is known." Holmes regarded Clara with a brief, penetrating glance, measuring her bearing, her composure, even the steadiness of her breath, then turned away. "Watson, Lestrade, with me?" Greaves led them up the stairs once more, his steps slow, as though each tread carried a memory he wished to avoid. When they reached the landing, Holmes paused with one hand lightly touching the banister. "Before we enter," he said in a low tone, "I would like a verbal map of the upstairs layout. Greaves, describe the rooms in relation to Sir Jasper's dressing room." Greaves blinked at the unexpected request, but answered promptly. "Sir Jasper's bedroom adjoins the dressing room by a door on the right. Lady Myton's chamber lies beyond Sir Jasper's, connected through another door, though it is seldom used. Miss Clara occupies a room further down the corridor. The servants' rooms are in the attic." "And there is no other entrance to the dressing room?" "None, sir." Holmes made a small sound of satisfaction and pushed the door open. The dressing room appeared exactly as before, gaslight hissing faintly, the body lying stiff upon the rug, and the mirrors, those uncanny, light-swallowing mirrors, standing like silent sentinels around the room. The oppressive dimness pressed in upon them at once. Watson felt the same involuntary shiver that had seized him upon first hearing Lestrade's account. Something about the space felt wrong, not merely unusual, but unnaturally subdued, as though the very air recoiled from the truth it held. Holmes crossed directly to the cheval-glass and examined it with quick, almost surgical precision. He leaned in so closely that his breath fogged the surface, though the mirror showed only the faintest ghost of his outline. "Fascinating," he murmured, "a uniform dulling with no visible patterning. Yet note, Watson, look here." Watson stepped beside him. Holmes tapped the edge of the mirror with a fingernail. The sound was crisp and normal, betraying no sign of damage or alteration beneath the surface. "Touch it," Holmes said. Watson placed his fingers against the glass. It felt cool, smooth, and wholly ordinary. Yet his own reflection remained barely perceptible, like an image viewed through a thick plume of smoke. Holmes stepped back, moving to the shaving glass. He adjusted its angle, tilting it toward the lamp. No reflection emerged beyond that same flat darkness. Then he inspected the wardrobe mirror, running his fingertips along the frame and pausing only briefly at the hinges. "There is a faint scent near this one," he said suddenly. "Watson, what do you make of it?" Watson leaned in. "A chemical odor, subtle, almost like burnt resin." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Not overpowering, but undeniably present." Lestrade frowned. "And someone applied something to the glass?" Holmes shook his head. "If it were a substance applied externally, the effect would not be so uniform, nor would it be so resistant to both smearing and light." He paused. "No, Inspector, the answer lies elsewhere." He moved to the body at last, kneeling with swift grace. His eyes darted across Sir Jasper's features, the contorted lips, the pallor, the subtle bluish stain upon the fingertips. "Watson," he said quietly, "note the rigidity. Death occurred at least an hour ago, and look at the pupils. Fixed, unreactive." Watson bent down. "Yes. And the hands, Holmes? Observe the faint, dark residue beneath the nails. Almost soot-like." Holmes mirrored his posture, and examined the carpet near the foot, where Lestrade had found the smudge. He lifted a pinch of the material between gloved fingers, then held it beneath his nose. "A trace of carbon," he murmured, "and something else." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Show me your fingers." Lestrade held them out. Holmes examined them closely, then nodded. "Watson, smell." Watson brushed his nose lightly against Lestrade's fingertips and detected the same faint, smoky aroma he had sensed by the wardrobe. "Holmes," he said, "is it possible the mirrors were exposed to smoke, a lamp blown out, a fire?" Holmes shook his head. "Impossible. The air lacks the heavy weight of burned oil. Besides, the distribution would be uneven. No, this is a controlled residue, not the product of open flame." He straightened abruptly, his expression sharpening. "Greaves," he said, "what was Sir Jasper's mood last evening? Was he anxious? Distracted?" Greaves hesitated. "Sir Jasper was preoccupied, sir. He had been so for several days." "Preoccupied with what?" "That I could not say. But he dismissed his valet earlier than usual and retired alone." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Alone? Important. Very important." He swept across the room once more, pausing before each mirror in turn. "Lestrade, when Thomas heard the cry, was it loud enough to suggest fear, pain, surprise?" "Surprise, I should think," Lestrade replied. "It was short, abrupt. A man startled," Holmes said softly. Startled at the very moment his reflection vanished. Watson frowned. "Holmes, are you suggesting Sir Jasper saw the mirrors blacken?" "I am suggesting," Holmes replied, "that whatever blackened them did so instantaneously, simultaneously, and in such a manner as to provoke a shocked response." His voice dropped. "A response that led directly to his death." Silence settled over the room, heavy as the fog outside. Holmes lifted his chin. This was no accident, no spontaneous phenomenon. Someone engineered this effect, and they were in this house tonight. Greaves stiffened. "Sir, you cannot mean—" Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "Not among those we have met necessarily. But the mechanism for this trick, if trick it was, required proximity, access, intent." Watson felt the familiar stir of awe as Holmes's mind leapt ahead. "What do you require next?" he asked. Holmes's answer was immediate. "Information, fresh air, and direct examination of the household, each member separately." His grey eyes glinted. "But before that, Watson, observe the windows." Watson turned. All 3 windows in the dressing-room had been drawn with heavy curtains. Holmes stepped to the nearest, sweeping it aside. The glass beyond was utterly black. Worse, it appeared not merely dark, but impenetrably so, the fog outside insufficient to explain such total opacity. Watson exhaled slowly. Holmes. The windows. Holmes smiled very faintly, a razor-thin curve of satisfaction. "Quite so. Mirrors are not the only things that may refuse to reflect." He released the curtain and stepped back. "We are dealing with an illusion very carefully constructed," he said, "and a death perfectly timed. But fear not, gentlemen, the veil is already beginning to lift." His eyes flicked toward the doorway. "And now the next piece of the puzzle awaits us downstairs." Holmes did not speak again until they had descended the stairs, but Watson could sense the quick, restless activity of his mind in the way his fingers drummed lightly upon the banister, and the way his eyes flicked to each shadow, as though measuring the house itself for answers. Greaves followed at a respectful distance, though his tightened jaw betrayed a tension he could no longer mask. When they entered the sitting-room once more, Clara Myton rose immediately. Her composure remained, but it had taken on a tremor, as though the weight of the night pressed more heavily upon her shoulders. "You have seen my uncle?" she said quietly. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe there was foul play?" Holmes regarded her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the same precise interest he might give to a specimen under glass. "Miss Myton," he said, "your uncle did not die by chance." Her fingers tightened around the back of the chair. "You are certain?" "Certain enough," Holmes murmured. "And more certain by the moment." Lady Myton stirred faintly on the sofa, but Clara pressed a soothing hand to her arm and guided her attention back to Holmes. "What do you intend to do now?" she asked. Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to avoid sending further shock through Lady Myton's fragile state. "I intend to ask a few simple questions of every member of this household." Clara nodded, though Watson sensed the inner conflict in her. "Very well, I will cooperate in whatever way you require." Holmes inclined his head slightly, then turned to the butler. "Greaves, begin with the servants. No need to bring them all at once. One at a time. And not Thomas yet. I wish to speak with the housemaids first." "Very good, sir," Greaves said, though unease flickered across his face. He departed through the hall. Holmes moved to the hearth, where he stood with one elbow on the mantel, eyes distant. Watson observed the familiar stillness that came over him at such moments, like a hound pausing at the faintest scent just before the chase. Lestrade stepped near. "Holmes, what good will questioning the maids do at this stage? Surely they saw nothing." "On the contrary," Holmes said without turning, "people often see far more than they realize. The difficulty lies in identifying what they saw." Watson leaned closer. "You mean to gauge their impressions? Their sense of the house tonight?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "It is not the dramatic observations that matter here, Watson. It is the small ones. A door left ajar that is usually shut, a scent that was not present earlier, a footprint where none should be, or," he added, eyes sharpening, "a mirror behaving in a manner wholly inconsistent with natural law." Clara shifted slightly. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "may I ask something?" Holmes looked at her. "By all means." "Do you have any theories as to why the mirrors appeared as they did?" Holmes did not answer at once. His gaze drifted to the curtained windows, recalling the unnatural blackness he had glimpsed there. "At present," he said finally, "I have 3 theories. One is improbable, one is highly improbable, and one is, for the moment, impossible. But I shall test each in turn." Before Clara could press him further, Greaves returned with the first housemaid, a timid young woman with downcast eyes and hands clasped tightly before her apron. "Mr. Holmes," Greaves announced, "this is Emily." Emily bobbed a frightened curtsy. Holmes's manner softened at once, his voice gentler than either Watson or Lestrade expected. "Emily," he said, "I shall not keep you long. I merely wish to know if anything struck you as unusual earlier this evening." Emily swallowed, her gaze flicking nervously between Holmes and Clara. "Unusual, sir?" "Yes. Any odd smell, sound, or tension in the house?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. Only the fog. It's been worse tonight than I've seen it." "A fair observation," Holmes said, "but nothing else?" Her brow creased in uncertain thought. "Well, there was the wardrobe door, sir." Holmes's eyes brightened. "The wardrobe door? Speak freely." "It was open when I came to fetch Lady Myton's shawl, sir," she said. "Not wide, but just open. Sir Jasper always kept it shut. He was particular about things being in their place." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson. He had already noted the wardrobe's orientation in the dressing room. An open wardrobe door would have altered the angle of the mirror even minutely. You were quite sure it was open? Yes, sir. That is, I thought perhaps Sir Jasper had opened it, but... Her voice trailed off, but Holmes nodded. You have been extremely helpful, Emily. Thank you. Emily curtsied again and hurried out, relieved. Greaves ushered in the second maid, older, sterner, more composed. Her name was Mrs. Walsh. Holmes repeated his quiet inquiries. She reported nothing unusual, save that earlier in the evening she had heard a soft tapping, as though someone were working in a distant room. Tapping? Holmes repeated. From where exactly? I cannot say, sir, Mrs. Walsh said. It was faint, almost like the sound of something being tightened. Holmes's eyes flashed. Tightened? Not hammered? No, sir. More like turning a screw. Holmes's fingers tightened behind his back. You may go, Mrs. Walsh. And thank you. When she had gone, Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You think someone was planting something? Holmes did not answer directly. I think, Inspector, that in a house where mirrors have been tampered with, any sound resembling the turning of a screw is of interest. Greaves cleared his throat. Shall I bring Thomas now, sir? Holmes paused. Then he nodded. Yes, the footman next. As Greaves departed, Holmes turned once more to Clara Myton. Miss Myton, may I trouble you with a question of my own? Of course. Has your uncle made any enemies recently? She faltered just for an instant. Enemies? Uncle Jasper was respected, admired. I do not ask about reputation, Holmes said. I ask about truth. Clara hesitated, then released a slow sigh. He's been troubled. That much I can say. There were letters, private letters, that disturbed him greatly. He burned them in the study fire before anyone could see them. Holmes's entire posture sharpened. Letters! Anonymous! Yes. Threatening? I believe so. And you only tell me now? Clara's jaw tightened. Because until this evening, I did not think they mattered. Holmes stepped closer, his tone suddenly very soft. Miss Myton, in matters of death, every detail matters. Before she could respond, Greaves reappeared with Thomas, the footman. The young man looked pale, shadows deepening beneath his eyes, as though the night had aged him. Holmes gestured him forward. Thomas, you discovered the body. I require you to recount everything you saw, without embellishment. Thomas swallowed and began haltingly to repeat his story. But as he spoke, Holmes watched him, not with the indulgent patience he had shown the maids, but with a meticulously focused scrutiny. Every tremor, every hesitation, every flick of the eyes was noted. And the mirrors? Holmes asked, when Thomas finished. Describe them. Thomas's gaze grew distant. All black, sir, all of them, as if the room had gone blind. Holmes held him in silence a long moment. When you touched Sir Jasper, he said quietly, did your fingers brush the carpet? I think so, sir. Only for a moment. And the smudge on your hand? That must have been from the carpet, sir. Holmes nodded slowly. That'll be all. When Thomas fled the room, Holmes turned to the others. Gentlemen, Miss Myton, the picture becomes clearer by the minute. Lestrade huffed. Clearer? It seems more puzzling with every word. Holmes gave a faint smile. That is because you are looking at the puzzle. I am looking at the frame surrounding it. And what do you see? Watson asked. Holmes lifted his chin. A deliberate manipulation of light, a timed event, an apparatus hidden somewhere within this house. He strode toward the door with sudden energy. And I intend to find it. Watson followed at once, heart quickening. For the first time that night, he sensed Holmes was drawing near to the invisible thread that would lead them deeper into the labyrinth. Deeper and perilously close to the truth. Holmes left the sitting room with such sudden purpose that Greaves, who happened to be lingering in the hallway, straightened instinctively as though anticipating a command. Holmes did not issue one at first. Instead, he strode several paces toward the foot of the stairs, paused, and swept his gaze across the hallway as though seeing it anew. "Watson," he said, "what is the first rule of stagecraft?" Watson blinked. "Stagecraft? Yes. The theatre, illusion?" Holmes gestured sharply. "What is its governing principle?" Lestrade muttered. "That nothing is as it seems." Holmes gave a thin smile. "More precisely, that the audience must not notice the mechanism behind the trick." Clara, who had followed them partway into the hall, watched him with knitted brows. "You believe we are dealing with a theatrical contrivance?" "Of a sort," Holmes said, "but one designed with scientific precision. Consider, every mirror in the dressing room blackened simultaneously, and even the window panes behaved in a similar manner. Such uniformity is no accident." Lestrade spread his hands. "But how could anyone have tampered with all of them? They're fixed in place, and even if someone had access, why blacken them instead of smashing them?" Holmes did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from the stairs to the side hallway, to the faint glimmer of lamplight reflecting on polished wood. Then he turned to Greaves. "Show me Sir Jasper's study." Greaves blinked. "His study, sir? But I thought—" "His study," Holmes repeated, already striding in its direction. Greaves hurried ahead to open the door. Clara and Lestrade exchanged quick glances before following. Watson stayed close behind Holmes, well accustomed to the detective's abrupt shifts of focus. The study was a rich wood-panelled room, lined with shelves and dominated by an imposing desk of dark mahogany. A fire still smouldered in the grate, its embers throbbing faintly beneath a thin crust of ash. Holmes crossed to it at once, crouching to lift a cold iron poker. "Miss Myton," he said without turning, "you mentioned earlier that your uncle burned several letters." Clara stepped in beside Watson. "Yes. 2 nights ago, I believe." "Here, in this grate?" "Yes." Holmes sifted lightly through the ashes. Most were fine and grey, but Watson saw some darker fragments among them, small pieces of charred paper that had not been consumed entirely. Holmes lifted one between tweezers and inspected its edge. "Notice the thickness, Watson," he said. This was not a sheet of ordinary writing paper, more like cardstock, a visiting card perhaps, or a stiff envelope. "Then the letters may have come with some formality," Watson suggested. "Quite possibly, but the content is what interests me." Holmes tilted the fragment, revealing an irregular streak of black along its side. "Do you see this discoloration? The burn marks are uneven." Clara stepped closer. "Is that unusual?" "For paper burned in an open flame?" "Not particularly. But this was not burned naturally. Look here, this edge is charred almost to a polish. That indicates high heat applied very quickly." Watson frowned. "Meaning the fire was hotter than ordinary wood embers?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "Someone used an accelerant, a volatile one." Lestrade stiffened. "To destroy the letters more completely?" Holmes rose to his feet. "Or to destroy what they carried with them?" He paced back to the center of the study, eyes scanning the shelves, the lamps, the walls. He paused at the window and examined its glass, a faint smear of condensation, but none of the opaque blackness he had seen upstairs. "Interesting," he said. Watson followed his gaze. "The windows here are normal?" "Yes." "Which means the effect was localized to Sir Jasper's dressing room, and perhaps 1 or 2 adjacent rooms." Lestrade folded his arms. "Holmes, all this talk of illusions and mechanisms, are you suggesting some device was set up in the dressing room?" "Not in the dressing room," Holmes said. "Near it." He turned abruptly toward Greaves. "Greaves, bring me the key to the attic." Greaves's eyes widened. "The attic, sir?" "Yes, at once." Clara stepped forward, uncertainty clouding her voice. "Mr. Holmes, what do you expect to find above the dressing room?" Holmes's answer came softly, but with unmistakable conviction. "The evidence of preparation, and I assure you, Miss Myton, something was prepared." Greaves hurried off, and Holmes began pacing again, hands clasped behind him. Watson recognized the rhythm, a rapid, restless sorting of possibilities. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "recall Mrs. Walsh's testimony, the sound of something being tightened." "Yes," Watson said, a metallic turning. "And Emily's observation, the wardrobe door left ajar, though Sir Jasper never left it so?" Watson nodded. "You think both details connect to the mechanism?" "They point to it," Holmes corrected. "But the heart of the matter, what caused the mirrors to blacken, lies not in the dressing room itself, but above it." Lestrade frowned. "But why blacken the mirrors at all? Why not simply kill Sir Jasper and be done with it?" Holmes stopped pacing. "Because the blackened mirrors were the killing method." Clara drew a sharp breath. Watson stared. Lestrade sputtered. "Holmes, that makes no sense. Mirrors don't kill." "No," Holmes said, "but what they reflect or refuse to reflect can do so by design." At that moment, Greaves returned with a metal key. Holmes seized it, already moving toward the staircase leading upward to the servants' level. "Watson, with me. Lestrade, remain below and ensure no one leaves the premises." Clara took a half step after him. "Mr. Holmes, please be careful." Holmes paused just long enough to offer her a brief, reassuring nod. "Fear not, Miss Myton. Danger rarely travels unaccompanied, and tonight I intend to meet it halfway." As he led Watson up the narrow stairs toward the attic, Holmes's voice dropped to a low whisper. "If I am correct, Watson, we are about to discover the core of this illusion and the first true trace of the murderer's hand." Watson felt a thrill, part dread, part anticipation. The air grew colder as they ascended, the house settling around them like a great brooding creature. Holmes paused before the attic door and inserted the key with deliberate care. What waited beyond it, Watson knew, would propel them deeper into the mystery. Holmes turned the key, and the lock clicked open with a soft, metallic sigh that seemed to echo far too loudly in the stillness of the house. Holmes pushed open the attic door, and a draught of cold, stagnant air met them, air that had not been disturbed in many weeks, perhaps months. The narrow staircase creaked beneath their feet as they ascended, Watson following cautiously, one hand brushing the rough wall for balance. The attic stretched before them as a long, dim space lined with old trunks, discarded furniture, and forgotten household miscellany. Only a single gas lamp mounted on the wall near the entrance cast a faint glow, its light struggling to penetrate the gloom. Holmes stepped forward, and immediately Watson sensed his friend's entire manner sharpen, his movements growing more precise, more deliberate. Holmes raised the lamp from its bracket and advanced deeper into the shadows. "Observe the floorboards, Watson," he murmured. Watson knelt and saw them, faint scuff marks near the center of the attic, where an outline of recently disturbed dust broke the otherwise undisturbed film that coated everything. Holmes crouched and brushed two fingertips lightly across the wood. "Someone stood here. Recently." Watson looked around the empty space. "But these boards are above Sir Jasper's dressing room." "Directly above," Holmes confirmed. "Which means our mechanism, if it exists, must be situated near this precise point." He raised the lamp higher, illuminating the rafters overhead. Nothing unusual appeared at first, only beams, cobwebs, and old insulation, but Holmes's gaze drifted downward to the space just ahead of them, where a large wooden chest sat against the floorboards. Holmes crossed to it at once. Watson followed. The chest was old, its brass fittings tarnished, its lid bowed slightly with age. But the lock, Watson noticed this at once, was new. Holmes examined it closely. This keyhole shows no signs of rust. And look here. He angled the lamp to reveal faint scratches around the metal. Used frequently, recently. Greaves said nothing of a new lock, Watson said. He may not know, Holmes replied. Households often assume old contents remain untouched merely because the exterior appears unchanged. He withdrew a set of lockpicks from his coat, and with a few deft motions the lock clicked open. Holmes lifted the lid. The contents were unexpected. Coils of black cloth lay folded inside, long, dense, and strangely heavy. Holmes lifted one between thumb and forefinger. It unfurled like a thick curtain, smooth on one side but coated with a dull, matte substance on the other. "What do you make of this, Watson?" Watson took the fabric carefully. "It feels treated. The surface is rough, almost like soot." "Carbon," Holmes said, "or a carbon-rich compound, very dark, very light-absorbent." Watson looked up sharply. "Holmes, are you suggesting these cloths were placed over the mirrors from above?" Holmes shook his head. "Not manually. That would require someone to enter the dressing room at the precise moment Sir Jasper cried out. No, this cloth was lowered by some mechanism." He lowered the lamp, scanning the floor near the chest. There, half hidden between loose boards, was a thin slit, narrow but unmistakably purposeful. "A sliding panel," Holmes breathed. "Ingenious." Watson knelt beside him. "This leads into the space above the dressing room?" "Yes, and through it, with the right contrivance, one could lower these cloths simultaneously over each mirror." Watson frowned. "But how would they be anchored? How could each one be positioned correctly?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A system of pulleys, Watson. Thin wires, perhaps threads of steel, running from this chest into the space above the dressing-room ceiling. Once triggered, the wires would release the cloths at once." "And the tapping sound Mrs. Walsh heard," Watson said slowly. "Someone tightening the apparatus, making sure everything was in place?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And Emily's observation, the wardrobe door ajar, is consistent with wires passing through small gaps. If the murderer needed access to align the cloth above the wardrobe mirror, he may have nudged the door without realizing it." Watson felt a chill run through him. "Holmes, this was planned meticulously." Holmes rose to his feet. "So meticulously that our murderer relied upon the effect to cause not just confusion, but death." Watson swallowed. "You truly believe Sir Jasper died from shock?" "From shock," Holmes said, "or from what the shock concealed." He moved further along the attic floor, the lamp casting long shadows. "Watson, think. A man enters his dressing room at night. He looks into the mirror, expecting his reflection. Instead, he sees utter darkness staring back at him. Not one mirror, but every mirror. The windows, too, suddenly blackened to match. That would be enough to startle anyone," Watson murmured. "More than startle," Holmes said. "It would unnerve even the strongest of men, especially a man already troubled by threatening letters." Watson understood. "A psychological attack?" Holmes's voice lowered. "Time to the heartbeat, and if a man's heart is already weakened—" A faint creak sounded behind them. Both men turned sharply, the lamp trembling in Holmes's hand. For an instant, Watson expected to see a lurking figure, a murderer cornered, but it was only the attic door swinging gently inward, stirred by some unseen draught. Yet something about its movement felt wrong, too slow, too deliberate. Holmes exhaled softly. "Ah, what is it?" Watson asked. Holmes raised the lamp, illuminating the area just beneath the latch. "There, Watson, a faint scuff mark. Someone was here tonight before us." Watson stared. "But Greaves said the attic remained locked." "So he believed," Holmes said, "but this lock shows signs of recent use, and the dust on the stair rails, notice the subtle smear. A hand passed there tonight." "You mean—" "The murderer returned," Watson whispered. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Or remained." Watson's pulse quickened. He tightened his hold on his cane. "Holmes, do you think he is still in the house?" Holmes turned toward the door, listening. Every breath of the old house seemed amplified. The distant crackle of the dying fire downstairs, the faint shift of a floorboard somewhere in the hall. "He is here," Holmes said quietly, "or was moments ago." He extinguished the lamp abruptly, plunging them into near darkness. "Holmes—" "Hush, Watson, listen." They stood very still. At first Watson heard nothing but his own breath. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, a sound drifted up from below. A footstep. Slow, measured, intentional. Holmes's whisper was a blade of sound in the dark. "The murderer is not fleeing." Watson felt the hair rise on his neck. "He's hunting." Holmes remained utterly still in the darkness, his breathing controlled, his posture poised like a drawn bow. Watson tried to imitate his composure, though his heart hammered violently against his ribs. The attic felt suddenly tighter, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. The footstep came again, soft but unmistakable, somewhere on the landing below. Not a servant's hurried tread, nor the uncertain pacing of a distressed lady, but something slow, precise, and measured, a step taken by someone moving with deliberate caution. Holmes leaned close enough that Watson felt his breath. "He is testing his advantage. Do nothing rash." Watson nodded silently, fingers tightening around his cane. Then the sound stopped altogether. A long, taut moment passed. Holmes moved first, soundless as a shadow, reaching for the attic door and easing it open a fraction of an inch. Watson saw the faintest sliver of light spill through from the landing, just enough to outline Holmes's focused profile. Holmes peered downward, then drew back. "He's gone from sight," he whispered. "But not far." Watson swallowed. Holmes, who could move through the house at such an hour without raising suspicion? Holmes's voice was barely audible. "Someone who belongs here, at least in appearance." "Someone whose presence would not provoke alarm." A servant, a family member, a visitor? The possibilities pressed in on Watson like the darkness surrounding them. Holmes motioned subtly toward the staircase. "Follow me, but tread lightly. The murderer has not yet revealed his intent, and men do not remain in the shadows without purpose." They descended one step at a time, carefully avoiding the boards Holmes had identified earlier as prone to creaking. Watson marveled even now at the detective's uncanny knowledge of the house's structure after so short a time within it. When they reached the landing, Holmes paused again, eyes flicking across the dim corridor. Only a single lamp burned here, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to breathe as the flame stirred. Lestrade's voice drifted faintly from the lower floor. "Miss Myton, I assure you no one has left this house. I would stake my reputation." Holmes held up a hand. Watson understood at once. The inspector must not yet be alerted. A premature warning could cause the intruder to flee, or worse, to lash out. Holmes turned toward the door of Sir Jasper's dressing room. It stood slightly ajar, though Watson was sure they had left it closed. Holmes's expression sharpened to a thin, dangerous line. He moved to the door with swift, silent steps and pushed it open. The room within looked the same as before, the blackened mirrors, the dim gaslight, Sir Jasper's still form on the floor. Yet something had changed. The air had a faint disturbance to it, as though recently disturbed. And then Watson saw it. A footprint, barely visible, but there, a faint smudge on the carpet near the wardrobe. The same dark residue Holmes had examined earlier now tracked ever so slightly across the pile. Holmes knelt instantly, examining it with a precision that bordered on reverence. "He was here," Holmes murmured. "Moments ago?" Watson felt his skin prickle. Holmes, was he in the attic with us, watching? Possibly. Or moving between rooms just ahead of us. Holmes rose. The mechanism upstairs was his work, and now he has come to inspect whether it was discovered. Watson glanced uneasily around the room. Why risk returning? Holmes's reply was soft and grim. Because something in this room matters to him, something he fears we might discover. He moved to Sir Jasper's desk just beyond the dressing-room door. A small writing table stood there, its drawers tightly shut. Holmes opened the first drawer without hesitation. Empty. The second. Empty again. The third drawer resisted him, locked. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Watson," he whispered, "give me your pocket-knife." Watson handed it over. With two swift motions, Holmes forced the catch. The drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside lay a packet of paper tied tightly with a cord. Holmes reached for it. A sound, sharp, metallic, cracked through the quiet. A gun being cocked. Watson froze. Holmes did not turn fully, but his head angled, eyes narrowing. From the doorway, half shrouded in the shadow cast by the tall cheval glass, a figure stood, a silhouette, unmistakable, armed. "Step away from the desk," the voice commanded. Low, gravel-edged, but not disguised. Watson's heart leapt. He recognized the voice at once. Greaves. The butler's broad form emerged into the dim lamplight, revolver raised and steady despite the slight tremor in his hand. Holmes straightened slowly, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of his lips. "Mr. Greaves," he said softly, "I wondered how long it would take you to reveal yourself." Watson stared, stunned. "Greaves, you?" Greaves's jaw clenched, his eyes flitting briefly toward the packet in Holmes's hand. "Put it down, sir." Holmes did not comply. "It is always the butler, is it?" he said in a tone almost musing. "A convenient assumption, one I rarely entertain, yet here we are." Greaves took one measured step forward, the gun unwavering. "You were not meant to see the attic," he said, "nor the apparatus. Sir Jasper, he was supposed to go quietly." Holmes tilted his head. "Quietly? That elaborate contrivance was meant to be quiet? You underestimate its theatricality." Greaves's voice cracked. "It wasn't for spectacle, it was necessary." Holmes took a single step toward him, slow and deliberate. "You engineered the illusion, Greaves. You triggered the mechanism. You stood behind the house's darkest trick. And now, having returned to assess the evidence, you find your secret slipping from your grasp." "Stop!" Greaves barked, raising the gun higher. Holmes did not stop. Watson felt panic surge. "Holmes!" Holmes's voice dropped to a silken whisper. "You know, Greaves, it takes a particular kind of man to murder his master using fear as a weapon. A particular kind of loyalty twisted into something darker." Greaves's hand trembled violently at last. "Don't come any closer," he whispered. "You don't understand. I had to do it." Holmes paused, only a breath away, eyes locked on his. "Oh," Holmes murmured, "I understand. Far more than you think." Greaves's expression crumpled, anger, grief, and desperation warring across his features. The revolver wavered. Holmes moved, a blur, swift, precise. Holmes knocked Greaves's wrist upward. The shot fired harmlessly into the ceiling. Watson lunged forward, seizing Greaves's arm as Holmes twisted the gun free with practiced ease. The butler collapsed against the wall, breath shuddering, eyes wide with defeat. Holmes held the gun loosely at his side. "Watson, fetch Lestrade," he said calmly. "Our murderer has unmasked himself." But as Watson hurried to call the inspector, Holmes's eyes drifted back, not to Greaves, but to the packet of letters still lying in the opened drawer. His expression hardened. "No," he murmured under his breath, "not unmasked, not yet." For Holmes had seen something in Greaves's face, something that suggested the butler's guilt was real, but not complete. Lestrade arrived in a rush, boots striking sharply against the floorboards as he barreled down the corridor. Clara appeared just behind him, pale and breathless, one hand gripping the banister as though afraid the house itself might sway beneath.
Her. When they stepped into the dressing room, their eyes widened at the sight of Greaves slumped against the wall, his breath ragged, Holmes standing over him with the revolver held lightly but securely. "Good heavens!" Lestrade exclaimed. "Holmes, what in blazes—" Watson cut in before Holmes could respond. "Inspector, Greaves confronted us with the weapon. Holmes disarmed him just in time. The man admitted to engineering the mirror trick." Lestrade approached slowly, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his coat. "Greaves, you fool. A butler of 20 years, undone by a contraption in the attic." Greaves did not answer. His face had drawn in upon itself, ashen, defeated, but with a strange flicker in his eyes that Holmes observed with growing suspicion. Clara stepped forward, voice trembling. "Mr. Greaves? Why, my uncle trusted you. You were his friend." At the word friend, Greaves's composure cracked. His shoulders sagged, and his voice emerged hoarse, raw. "I served Sir Jasper faithfully for half my life, Miss Clara, but he was not the man you believed." Clara recoiled, grief mixed with confusion. "That is a lie." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "No, not entirely. But Greaves, before you descend into riddles, answer me plainly. Did you intend Sir Jasper's death?" Greaves closed his eyes. Not as it happened. I meant only to frighten him, to force him to reveal the truth, or to confess it." A murmur rippled through the room. Lestrade snorted. "Confess what? To whom?" Holmes lifted a hand, silencing him. Greaves opened his eyes at last, eyes heavy with remorse. "To all of you, but especially to her." He nodded faintly toward Clara. Clara's breath hitched. What truth could possibly concern me? Greaves's lips pressed into a thin, strained line. That Sir Jasper was being blackmailed for something he did years ago, something that endangered you more than anyone. Clara staggered back, and Watson hurried to steady her. Holmes watched her reaction intently, noting every subtle shift in her expression. "And the apparatus in the attic?" Holmes pressed. "The cloths, the pulleys, the blackened windows. What purpose did they serve?" Greaves's voice turned hollow. "To break him. To make him believe the shadows had come for him at last. He was a man plagued by guilt. I thought the sight of darkness closing in from every mirror would force his confession. His heart was weakened, yes, but I never imagined." His voice trailed off. Lestrade snapped the cuffs around Greaves's wrists with finality. "Intent or not, you set events in motion that killed him." Greaves did not protest. Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Greaves could hear. "Yet something troubles you still. You have confessed to the apparatus, the timing, the illusion, and yet I sense you are holding back." Greaves's gaze darted upward, fleeting, fearful. "Because I am not the one who sent the letters." Holmes's expression sharpened like a blade. "Ah?" Clara covered her mouth, eyes wide. "The letters? Someone else?" Greaves nodded. Sir Jasper entrusted them to me before he burned them. They were unsigned, typed, ruthless. The writer knew secrets only someone within the family could know. And Sir Jasper feared. He feared it was someone close. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Why didn't you tell us? Because he forbade it, Greaves whispered. And because I thought if he confessed first, the real culprit would be forced into the light. Holmes folded his arms. So, you constructed a theatrical assault on his senses, hoping to push him toward a confession. The mechanism, clever but vicious, and when he cried out, when his heart failed, you panicked. Greaves swallowed, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. I meant only to frighten him, not kill him. Holmes nodded once. Your intentions, misguided though they were, do not absolve you, but neither do they conclude this matter. Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? We have the culprit. No, Holmes said firmly. We have a culprit, but not the author of the letters, and very likely not the architect of the deeper crime behind this one. He turned toward Clara. Miss Myton, earlier you mentioned the letters disturbed your uncle, that he burned them personally. Clara nodded, though her eyes were now distant, troubled. He said they concerned a matter from his past, something he regretted. But he told you nothing more? No. Holmes approached her slowly, his tone careful. And this matter, did he ever hint it involved the estate or your inheritance? Clara blinked. My inheritance? No, at least, I don't believe so. Uncle Jasper provided for Aunt Edith and me. Beyond that, I know nothing of his affairs. Holmes shook his head. Not affairs, Miss Myton, but lineage. Clara stiffened. Holmes continued gently. Your uncle was a man of outward virtue, but inward anxiety. A man who harboured a secret so weighty he burned every letter that referenced it, yet did not destroy the last set entirely. That is significant. Greaves looked up suddenly. You found them, didn't you, in the drawer? Holmes nodded. Partially burned, but intact enough. Lestrade bristled. Holmes, if you have evidence— I will examine it in due time, Holmes interrupted. First, I must determine who stood to gain from Sir Jasper's death, and more specifically, who stood to gain from Clara Myton's potential ruin. Clara stared at him, colour draining from her cheeks. Ruin? I do not understand. What ruin? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he turned to Lestrade. Inspector, take Greaves below and secure him. Do not permit anyone to speak with him. We are not finished. Lestrade obeyed reluctantly, guiding the butler out of the room.
When they had gone, Holmes turned to Watson. Watson, observe Miss Myton closely. She is processing revelations of great emotional weight. Her reactions are key. Watson nodded gravely. Holmes stepped toward Clara, his voice lowering. Miss Myton, I ask you now, did your uncle ever hint, ever even imply, that your position in this family was not as simple as you believed? Clara stared at him with widening eyes. My position? Holmes held her gaze. Yes, for unless I am much mistaken, the blackmail letters concerned you. Clara drew a sharp breath, and for a moment Watson feared she might faint. But Holmes was not finished. And whoever sent those letters was here tonight. A silence fell so deep it felt like another presence in the room. Then somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked. Watson flinched. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The true puppeteer, he whispered, has not yet stepped into the light. Clara swayed slightly, and Watson instinctively stepped closer, though he did not touch her. Holmes was watching her with the keen, unblinking attentiveness of a naturalist observing a rare and delicate specimen, every breath, every flicker of eyelid measured against his mental ledger of possibilities. No, she whispered at last. "Mr. Holmes, that is impossible. My uncle would never—" Holmes raised a hand, his tone measured. "I ask only that you listen before deciding what is impossible." Another floorboard creaked, not close, somewhere far below, faint but deliberate, a reminder that someone else was awake in the great quiet house, listening or moving or making sure they were not heard. Holmes shifted his weight, just a fraction, and Clara seemed to gather herself under his gaze. "You say the letters were about me?" she said quietly. "Why? What could anyone have used against him?" Holmes glanced at Watson, then back to Clara. "There are a number of possibilities, Miss Myton, some mundane, some less so. But before I venture a hypothesis, I require a certain detail which only you can provide." Clara swallowed, nodding. "Tell me," Holmes said gently, "about your parents." She blinked. "My parents? But I have told you they died when I was very young." "Yes," Holmes said. "You said so earlier, but I ask again, what do you know of them?" Clara hesitated. "Very little. My mother was Sir Jasper's younger sister. She married beneath her station, a man of modest means. They both died of fever when I was 5. Uncle Jasper took me in." "And your father's name?" Holmes pressed. "Robert Hale." Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson saw the faint tightening around his eyes, a sign that some internal deduction had just aligned into place. Holmes turned to Watson. "Watson, do you recall the name Hale in relation to last year's legal scandal? A forged signature on a deed involving land inheritance." "Vaguely," Watson said. "The newspapers reported irregularities, but the matter was resolved quietly. No charges were laid." "Precisely because," Holmes murmured, "the primary beneficiary disappeared before the investigation concluded." Clara's breath caught. "Mr. Holmes, you cannot possibly mean—" "My father?" Holmes held up a hand. "I do not say he was guilty, Miss Myton, only that his name appeared tangentially in a case involving fraudulent claims to estates, and that case intersected intriguingly with Sir Jasper Myton's personal holdings." Clara shook her head, baffled. "I had no idea." "And likely," Holmes said gently, "your uncle hoped you never would." Watson leaned in. "Holmes, you believe Sir Jasper feared Clara might lose her inheritance if the truth became known?" "Blackmailers rarely threaten without leverage," Holmes replied. "Someone used knowledge of her parentage, real or fabricated, against Sir Jasper. He burned the letters to prevent anyone from connecting them." Clara turned away, her voice faint. "Then why kill him? Why terrify him into a heart attack? Why not simply continue the blackmail?" "Because," Holmes said, "the blackmailer's goals shifted. Blackmailers seldom remain satisfied with one arrangement. Greed escalates. Or perhaps the blackmailer realized Sir Jasper was preparing to confess all." The floorboard below creaked again. Holmes's head snapped up. Watson felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Someone is coming." "No," Holmes whispered. "Someone is watching." The room fell still. Even the gaslight seemed to dim in its hiss. Without warning, Holmes strode across the hall and extinguished the nearest lamp. Darkness dropped heavily over them, broken only by the faint glow from the end of the corridor. "Holmes!" Watson hissed. "Quiet," Holmes murmured. "Observe." They stood motionless. A faint shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, so subtle that Watson might have dismissed it as a trick of the eye had Holmes not stiffened beside him. A figure, tall and slender, paused at the corner, almost blending with the gloom. Clara gasped softly. Holmes reached back and steadied her with a touch. "Stay behind me, Miss Myton," he whispered. The figure retreated as soon as they were noticed, swift, silent, unmistakably intentional. Holmes surged forward. "Watson, after him!" They rushed down the corridor, Holmes moving like a falcon in pursuit, Watson following close behind. Clara stayed rooted in the doorway, torn between fear and instinctive trust in Holmes's command. The figure darted down the main staircase, the flicker of movement just visible as Holmes reached the landing and leapt down the first steps. Watson followed, nearly tripping on the last few out of sheer speed, but when they reached the entry hall they found it empty, silent, save for the creak of the house settling. "Damn!" Watson muttered, chest heaving. He vanished. Holmes was not discouraged. "Not vanished, Watson. Evaded. The downstairs level has 5 possible hiding places, 6 if one includes the servants' corridor." Lestrade, hearing the commotion, came barreling from the parlour. "Holmes, what's happened?" Holmes raised a hand. "Silence, Lestrade. Listen." They all fell still. A soft clicking sound drifted from the far end of the servants' passage, metal on metal. "The cellar door?" Holmes breathed. He sprinted toward it, Watson and Lestrade at his heels. They reached the servants' hallway just in time to see the cellar door swinging shut. Holmes flung it open and descended without hesitation. Cold air rushed up to meet them, damp and heavy. The cellar was darker than the attic had been, the feeble bulb overhead giving off only a sickly yellow glow. The smell of old stone and coal dust thickened the air. "Watson, to the right," Holmes called. Watson obeyed, sweeping his cane ahead of him. Lestrade moved left, handgun drawn now, breath sharp in the chill. Holmes moved straight ahead toward the shadowy recesses where wine racks and coal stacks cast sprawling shapes across the walls. "Come out," Holmes said softly. "There is no escape from this place." A faint scuffle answered him, someone stepping back against loose gravel. Holmes smiled faintly. "You should surrender now. The cellar is boxed in. Your only advantage is the dark, and that is insufficient." A sudden metallic clang rang out, a shelf being struck, a distraction. Holmes ignored it. Watson swung toward the noise, but Holmes held up a hand. "Not there!" He turned abruptly and lunged toward a narrow alcove near the far wall. A figure bolted from the shadows. Watson saw only a flash of movement, the gleam of pale skin, the outline of a face racked with desperation. Then Lestrade fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the stone. The figure froze. Holmes grabbed him by the coat and dragged him into the dim light. Watson stared, stunned. It was not a servant, not a hired hand, not even an acquaintance. It was a young man, barely 20, dishevelled, trembling, eyes wild with fear. Holmes's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "Ah, so it is you then." Lestrade slapped cuffs on the youth's wrists. "Who is he?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving the young man's face. "Watson," he said quietly, "allow me to introduce Mr. Leonard Hale, Clara's cousin, the heir whose name she believed long dead, and the one person with everything to gain from Sir Jasper's fall and from Clara's ruin." Watson's breath caught. The true puppeteer had finally stepped into the lantern's glow. Leonard Hale stared at them with the wide, frantic eyes of an animal cornered. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his thin chest heaving beneath a coat far too fine for the shadows he had been hiding in. Holmes released his grip only when Lestrade had fastened the cuffs securely, and even then the youth shrank back as though expecting a blow from every direction. Holmes took a step back, studying the boy with a detached precision entirely devoid of malice. "You were remarkably nimble on the stairs," he said softly. "Your father was known for the same swift-footedness, a family trait, I presume?" The boy flinched as though the words themselves struck him. "You know nothing about my father," he spat, though his voice quavered. Holmes raised an eyebrow. On the contrary, I know more than you might wish, including the fact that Sir Jasper believed your father's past could be used to dispossess Miss Clara of her inheritance. Leonard's eyes flickered, anger, fear, stubborn defiance all rising and collapsing in the same moment. He looked from Holmes to Watson, then to Lestrade, and finally toward the stairs where Clara now appeared, pale but resolute, gripping the banister as she descended into the cellar. Her voice trembled. "Leonard, is it true? You lived all this time?" He did not answer her immediately. He stared at her as if she were a ghost summoned from a memory he had long tried to bury. When he did speak, his tone was low and accusatory. "You had everything," he whispered, "everything that should have been mine." Clara stared, stunned. "Yours? Leonard, my uncle raised me out of charity because I had no one else." "Charity?" Leonard laughed bitterly. "He took pity on you, but on me, he took everything. My father was ruined because of him." Holmes folded his arms. A convenient piece of fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. Robert Hale's forgery of land deeds would have come to light with, or without, Sir Jasper's involvement. Your father was no victim. "You're lying," Leonard flared, but his protest lacked conviction. The defiance in his posture sagged. "You don't know what happened. You can't." Holmes stepped forward, his tone calm yet cutting. "I know this. Your father attempted to defraud the Myton estate. Sir Jasper suppressed the matter to spare the family shame. Yours and Clara's. He paid your father's debts, Leonard, quietly, without fanfare, and in return he received a promise." Leonard's lips moved soundlessly. Watson felt pity stir in him. "A promise to leave the Myton family in peace," he said softly. Holmes nodded. "A promise Robert Hale broke when you began sending the blackmail letters." Leonard's shoulders slumped. His defiance drained away like water seeping from a cracked jar. "I only wanted what should have been mine," he murmured. "And you believed driving Sir Jasper into a confession would secure it?" Holmes asked. "Or did you hope the scandal would leave Clara without standing, making you the next heir by default?" Clara recoiled as if struck. "Leonard, is that why? This inheritance? This house? That is what you cared about?" Leonard's mouth opened, then shut. His voice emerged hoarse. "You don't understand what it was like, living hidden, waiting for the chance to reclaim what my father lost. I thought it would all be restored." Holmes's eyes bored into him. "You conspired with Greaves." Leonard hesitated. "No, not at first. I found out he had suspicions about Uncle Jasper's letters. I thought if I fed them, if I told him half-truths, he might help reveal the rest. He was already resentful, already watching." "And you let him take the blame," Clara said, horror dawning. "You let him believe you wanted only a confession." Leonard's throat tightened. He did want that. He believed Sir Jasper, guilty of worse. "I only nudged the pieces. I never meant to kill him." "Neither did Greaves." Holmes exhaled slowly. Intent is not always the measure of guilt. The apparatus in the attic, the carbon-treated cloths, the pulleys, the sliding panel. Greaves constructed it, yes. But you were the one who conceived the idea, were you not? Leonard looked down. Silence served as his answer. Holmes turned to Watson. "Observe. Greaves's craftsmanship, Leonard's design, a conspiracy of fear." Watson nodded grimly. "And Sir Jasper's heart was simply too weak for such a shock." Holmes's eyes softened, briefly. "No killer's hand touched him, yet he was killed all the same." Lestrade cuffed Leonard's wrists more firmly. "Right. That's enough philosophy. Young Hale, You're under arrest for blackmail, conspiracy, and accessory to murder." Leonard sagged, defeated. Clara looked away, struggling to contain tears. Holmes laid a hand gently on her arm. "The sins of others do not tarnish you, Miss Myton. Remember that?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "I only wish Leonard had come to us, to me." "He came for inheritance," Holmes said softly. "Not forgiveness." Holmes motioned for Lestrade to take Leonard away. As they ascended from the cellar, Holmes lingered behind, drawing Watson aside. "You see it now, Watson? The mirrors were never meant to kill, they were meant to frighten. A theatrical illusion built on fear and guilt. Leonard's letters prepared the mind. Greaves's mechanism delivered the final blow. And Sir Jasper's own conscience did the rest," Watson murmured. "Precisely," Holmes said. "A death without a murderer's touch, yet undeniably orchestrated." They returned to the dressing-room, where Clara waited alone. Holmes paused at the threshold. "There remains one final matter, Miss Myton. Your uncle left a letter for you." Clara's head snapped up. "A letter?" Holmes handed her the partially burned packet recovered from the desk. "Not all was destroyed. These fragments reveal his intent to confess the truth and secure your standing. Sir Jasper was not the villain Leonard claimed." Clara's hands shook as she accepted the papers. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Truly." Holmes bowed slightly. "I am merely an instrument of clarity." Lestrade's voice echoed from the hall. "Holmes, we're ready to take him." Holmes turned. "Coming." As he stepped into the corridor, Watson saw Clara sink into a chair, clutching the singed papers against her heart. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The first pale touch of dawn pressed faintly at the windows. Watson joined Holmes at the landing. "A tragic case," he said quietly. Holmes's expression softened with a rare, contemplative gravity. "Tragic, yes, yet instructive. Fear is the most potent of weapons, Watson, more lethal than any blade. It can twist loyalty, distort reason, and in this case, end a life." They descended together, Holmes already reaching for his coat. "And now," he said, "a fresh day begins. Perhaps Mrs. Hudson has prepared breakfast." Watson smiled faintly. "Holmes, only you could segue from death to breakfast in a single breath." Holmes gave the faintest shrug. "Life, my dear Watson, demands sustenance, and clarity of mind requires tea." They stepped into the pale London morning, leaving behind the house where mirrors had turned black, and where truth, at last, had found its reflection. The fog outside had thinned into a pale morning haze by the time Holmes and I stepped back into the drawing-room of number 48 Portland Place. The gas lamps had been extinguished, and the first light of dawn filtered through the tall windows, softening the stark contours of the night's grim events. Clara Meaton sat quietly by the hearth, the packet of her uncle's singed letters still clasped in her hands. Her eyes were rimmed red, yet there was a newly formed steadiness in her expression, an acceptance born of truth reclaimed from shadows. Holmes paused beside her. "Miss Myton," he said gently, "the inspector will conclude the necessary formalities shortly. You may expect some inquiries from the magistrate, but I do not believe you will be troubled beyond that. Your uncle intended to protect you to the last." Clara looked up at him, lips trembling with sorrow and gratitude mingled. "Mr. Holmes, what am I to do now? My uncle is gone. Leonard will stand trial. The household, everything is adrift." Holmes lowered his head in respectful solemnity. "You must do precisely what Sir Jasper wished of you. Continue the family line with integrity. Rebuild what fear tried to destroy." His eyes warmed. "You are stronger than you know, Miss Myton." She managed a faint nod, and Holmes turned away, allowing her a moment's privacy. Lestrade entered just then, removing his bowler hat and exhaling a long breath. "Holmes, the young man's being taken to the yard. We'll get the full statement from Greaves as well. A messy affair, this. Blackmail, conspiracy, manslaughter. The court will have its work cut out." Holmes gave a small, contemplative hum. "Indeed, but the essential truth is clear enough. Now, the law will sort the finer strands." Lestrade eyed him curiously. "Tell me one thing. How did you know the boy was still in the house when we first searched?" Holmes allowed himself a single, thin smile. "Because the mechanism in the attic required testing immediately before use. Leonard Hale would not have trusted Greaves's handiwork alone, and when Sir Jasper cried out it was too late for Hale to flee without being seen, his only choice was to hide and watch the consequences of his scheme unfold." Lestrade shook his head. "Cold-blooded, that one." Holmes's gaze drifted back toward the staircase. "Not cold-blooded, Inspector. Misguided, poisoned by a narrative of grievance fed since childhood. Greaves supplied the tool, but the boy supplied the will." Lestrade huffed. "You and your philosophies." But his eyes softened a little. "Still, good work, Holmes. I doubt we'd have seen the attic trick if not for you." With that he departed to finalize arrangements, leaving Holmes and me alone in the quiet parlor. Holmes stood by the tall window, looking out across the street where the dawn painted the fog in pale gold. He seemed momentarily lost in contemplation, the way he often was when a case reached its end and something within him sought equilibrium. I approached quietly. "Holmes, your deduction was extraordinary, but I cannot help feeling there is more to this affair than crime alone." Holmes's voice, when he answered, was low and thoughtful. "You are correct, Watson. A crime is rarely an isolated act. It is a knot of circumstances, motives, and fears, all tightening until someone cannot bear the weight. Leonard Hale believed himself wronged. Greaves believed himself protector, and Sir Jasper believed himself the guardian of family honor. Each delusion drew breath from secrecy." He turned toward me. "There is a lesson here, Watson. Concealment breeds calamity. Had Sir Jasper trusted Clara with the truth, Leonard's leverage would have evaporated." I nodded. "You often say that sunlight is the best disinfectant." "That I do," Holmes replied, "and this night proves it once more." Clara rejoined us then, calmer than before. The letters, her uncle's last confessions, were now bound carefully with a fresh ribbon. She looked at Holmes with a steadiness that belied the tumult of the hours past. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I owe you more than words can express. My uncle's name, my own future. You have protected both." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth was always there, Miss Myton. I merely illuminated it." She hesitated, then offered a small, hopeful smile. "Would you and Dr. Watson accept my invitation to return another day? When the house is less haunted by the shadows of this night?" Holmes's eyes softened. "We should be honored, Miss Myton." She thanked us again before retreating upstairs to rest. When she had gone, Holmes reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, our work here is done." We stepped out into the cool morning air. The fog was lifting, revealing the outlines of London stirring awake, carriages clattering in the distance, chimney smoke rising in thin curls, the muted hum of a city resuming its ceaseless pulse. As we began our walk toward Baker Street, I studied my friend's face. There was a faint satisfaction there, but also the distant, restless gleam that always heralded Holmes's search for the next challenge. "You are unusually quiet," I remarked. "Only reflective," Holmes said. "Appropriate," I replied. "Given the mirrors?" Holmes allowed himself a brief chuckle. Ah, Watson, a rather on-the-nose observation, but not incorrect. His eyes darkened slightly. Those mirrors, once blackened by deception, now reflect something else. The truth has been restored. And justice, I added. Justice, yes, Holmes agreed. Though imperfect, as justice often is, but sufficient for this world. We walked in companionable silence for a moment before Holmes spoke again, musing aloud. Fear, Watson, is a curious foe. It can be harnessed by the wicked, suffered by the innocent, or wielded unintentionally as a weapon. Tonight, it did all three, but it was conquered in the end by clarity, and I hope, by compassion. The sun broke fully above the rooftops then, casting long rays of light across the pavement. Holmes drew a deep breath. Now, my dear fellow, let us return home. Mrs. Hudson will have the kettle on, and I feel the onset of a rare indulgence. Oh, I said. And what indulgence is that? A second cup of tea, he said, with the faintest smile. For clarity of mind, of course. And so we walked on, leaving behind the house where every mirror turned black, and where, through Holmes's brilliance, the truth finally shone.